Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Dan Hamilton. I direct the Global Europe program at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Today, we have an international audience to join us to discuss Germany and great power competition. As I'm sure most people know, Germany is headed to federal elections in just a few weeks, and there's great discussion about how the next government's foreign policy will look. And particularly the United States, I think we're looking at how Germany relate not only to the US in the future, but also to China and Russia, and how that interferes and intervenes, intertwines with US relations with those other great powers. So we'd like to focus on sort of the German debate on those issues today. We have sent around to you all of the speakers' backgrounds. We'd like to ask them each to kick off a discussion, but then to have as much of a discussion as we can. You can join that discussion by sending us a tweet at gep@wilsoncenter.org, or that's the email, gep@wilsoncenter.org, or a tweet at Wilson Center GEP. Let me repeat that. If you'd like to join with a question or comment by email, gep@wilsoncenter.org, or send us a tweet at Wilson Center GEP. I'll try to weave in your questions and comments after we start with our speakers. So we're delighted today to have Janke Ertel, Angela Stent, and Stefan Meister join us. John Kornblum has sent apologies. He's unable to join us as we had planned. But we have a great team here to talk about this issue. There's a lot of discussion, has been for a long time traditionally, about German relations with Russia. That's somewhat familiar ground. But the debate on how Germany is thinking about its relations with China has become quickly a top level issue, especially in how Americans are thinking about this. And I think that it'd probably be more interesting for us to start with China and then turn to Russia. So for that, I'm going to turn first to Janke, who's really one of Germany's foremost experts on German perceptions and relations with China, to give us a sense of that, and then we'll turn to our other speakers to round out the picture. Janke, please help us understand how the German debate is evolving, how people are discussing China's rise, its relationship to Germany, and how that might go forward under a new government. If you could speculate on that, I realize that's hard to do right now. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Dan, for the kind invitation, and I will be happy to speculate as well, because it's fun. I mean, this is what we do in the end, after all, and everyone enjoys that a bit as well. But don't pin me towards that I'm just looking in the crystal ball for you a bit in the end. So on Germany's China relations, I think this is one of the key areas where there's excitement in the conversation, because things have moved so quickly, because they've changed so quickly. Basically, you can describe the past decades of China-Germany engagement very much with a trade-focused agenda. Say this was about business, and particularly German business was doing incredibly well in China. It's making a lot of money, and things were just fine. The political relations, particularly under the Merkel era, had evolved and evolved ever more closely, and the conversations with China were to a degree kind of in a fruitful territory. So Angela Merkel's time in office was very much conditioned by a positive development of the relationship with China, a positive economic development, and a very kind of prosperous condition. Fast forward, when Xi Jinping comes into the place, about mid of Chancellor Merkel's reign, things change in China. And because things change in China, the conditions for German business in China changes as well. And this does have an impact on the conversation, not least until 2019, roughly, we still have a very predominant kind of positive economic cooperation agenda going on, but the changes are so clear for German business, and these are not changes that are relevant in terms of human rights violations in China, etc. It's the business conditions that very much condition the changing perceptions in Germany, where the change is then emanating from the business community exerting pressure on the political actors. So in 2019, we have the publication of the German Federation of Industries China paper, which is a seminal report on how different the outlook on China in the future is likely going to be. The holy trinity that was established at the time was that of China being simultaneously a partner, an economic competitor, but also a systemic rival. And this has become kind of the mantra of European policy and has actually been replicated all over the world in many ways, as this is the way of looking at China under the new conditions. Now, we're 2 years later now in the current conversation, and one can say we're already a step further in the conversation. What we have learned is that partner is not the same as being the necessity to cooperate on areas of mutual concern, and that partner is actually something more, and that it becomes increasingly hard to find any area where China can be described as truly a partner and not just someone who you necessarily have to coordinate policies with or cooperate with when applicable. But partnership is a bigger word. And the second thing that has been kind of reevaluated is the dimension of rivalry, systemic rivalry. The systemic rivalry has become so pronounced, particularly since the beginning of the pandemic, that it is becoming, in terms of that holy trinity, all of those factors next to each other, one that outweighs the others. So what we can say is that the new kind of movement in the debate and the new consensus that is slowly emerging among the German parties is that what we are facing is actually competition and cooperation against the backdrop of systemic rivalry, which is kind of a development of the Holy Trinity that we've seen 2 years ago. This is actually something that has found its way already in the party conversations and in the party, in many of the parties' kind of position papers. And this is something that is going to shape the policies in the post-Merkel era very much. This is not something that is just the Greens, just the FDP, just the Christian Democrats, or just the Social Democrats saying, but this is pretty much a slowly emerging consensus with different consequences that are drawn from this. What will this mean for German policy after the election? Change is about to come. That's something that is rare, particularly because the Germans are so status quo oriented, but status quo policies here would be detrimental for German prosperity, detrimental for German political and economic interests. Therefore, change is the only kind of realpolitik answer in German China policy. This change will not happen as a revolution, but it will be gradual. It will be a slow detanglement. We see a lot of calls for diversification. We see a lot of calls for caution, but what we will not see is sudden decoupling of the German economy from China. But these notions of a slow shift coming about also with Germany's Indo-Pacific guidelines that have been announced, and these kind of strategic diversification that we're seeing will be quite substantial. What the other Europeans are expecting of Germany is also a clearer positioning on the controversial issues when it comes to China, and a clearer positioning in general when it comes to kind of how do we relate to authoritarian systems. And I think this is kind of where we see the intersection of the China and the Russia conversation as well. The one party that has been the clearest and most outspoken about it so far among the three parties that are fielding a chancellor candidate have been the Greens. The ones that have been the most cautious in their approach so far have been the Christian Democrats. And with the Social Democrats, we're not 100% sure where Olaf Scholz stands on many of these issues. So we will see where things are moving. What we can say, though, is that as the Greens and the FDP are very likely going to be part of any governing coalition, and their positions on China are very clear, that this will have a conditioning effect on government policy. And I just leave it at here, and then we can discuss further.
Right, thank you, Janka. You mentioned the Greens and the Free Democrats probably in any coalition. As I understand, both of their positions are tougher than the kind of mainstream parties at the moment for different reasons. So that's an interesting. I wonder if that carries over to approaches to Russia. As I said at the beginning, we're accustomed to having a discussion about Germany and Russia. That's a long-standing relationship, obviously very close in some ways, but fraught with complications. And it's become a particular issue in U.S. German relations because, particularly because of the Nord Stream debate. It's still a hot issue in Washington. And so, Angela, I wonder if you could help us understand, German evolving views also on the relationship with Russia. Angela Merkel won't be there to talk to Vladimir, and will successor have the same type of tone and approach? Do you notice, might there be any shifts also in relationship to Russia?
Okay, thanks, Dan. I'm delighted to be part of this conversation. And I'm going to start with Angela Merkel's recent visit to Moscow, her farewell visit as chancellor, because I think it exemplifies some of the tensions inherent in the policies that she and her different coalition governments have tried to follow since she became chancellor. Putin met her with a bouquet of flowers, which is now customary for him since he stopped sending his Labrador Connie to meet her, if you remember that. And the chancellor stressed how important it was to maintain a dialogue with Russia, even though there were many issues on which they disagreed. And they did discuss, of course, their common economic interests, Nord Stream 2 pipeline. She publicly said that she was very hopeful that Gazprom would renew its contract, its deal with Ukraine as a transit country after 2024, and Putin was non-committal about that. But after that, and after the sort of talk about how important dialogue was, she was highly critical, obviously, of the poisoning of opposition leader Alexei Navalny, who, of course, as you all know, was treated in Germany, and she demanded that they release Navalny from prison. But of course, she got absolutely no response to that. So we have a juxtaposition there in this visit of outreach and insistence on dialogue on the one hand, with criticism of Russia and support for some sanctions on the other. And I think it's become more challenging, obviously, for Germany, for Merkel to maintain this kind of dual, finely tuned policy since 2014, since the Russian annexation of Crimea and the launch of a war in the Donbass. Merkel has tried to keep German industry on board, of course, by promoting economic ties with relations with Russia. She has, of course, supported Nord Stream throughout all of these debates over the objections of the United States and Ukraine and the Baltic states and some other countries. She did come to a compromise with President Biden when she visited him that they would try and help Ukraine move away from this dependence on gas transit fees to have a more green energy economy and things like that. And she did go to Kiev after she met with Putin, but all of these plans are rather vague still. I would say they're aspirational. Now, I would argue that the return of great power competition, and I do want to say a word about this now, is unwelcome for Germany, and I'll be interested to hear what other people view about this. I mean, obviously, during the Cold War, the two German states were on either side, opposite sides of a bipolar great power competition, and that West German Ostpolitik, of course, was only possible against the background of the Westbindung. And even then, as we know, Nixon and Kissinger greatly objected to Brandt's initial Ostpolitik and were only slowly reconciled to it. So a united Germany welcomed the end of great power competition, or what appeared to be that, in the 1990s. And for a time, it looked as if Russia wanted to integrate with the West. And Russia's rejection of this kind of attempts to integrate with the West really coincide more or less with Merkel's election. They became slightly earlier under Putin. And after 2004, Putin came to see the West increasingly as a threat and as a block to his ambitions to restore Russia as a great power. And he sought Western recognition for that. And of course, despite Germany under Schröder joining with France and Russia to oppose the Iraq war, really nothing very much came of this kind of brief coalition of the unwilling. And then since then, you had Germany's repeated attempts to partner with Russia to encourage modernization, and they've really all come to naught. And Merkel herself has more or less acknowledged that in recent days. So we have Duma elections coming up this month in Russia, as well, of course, as the elections in Germany. Now, the outcome of the Duma elections, of course, are known, unlike the outcome of the German elections. But what we know is we're going to have many more years of a consolidated Putin rule. He could be in power till 2036 if he wants to be, or even beyond then. So Germany will be dealing with this system for many years to come. U.S.-Russian relations may improve slightly under the Biden administration. There are already attempts to coordinate much more with Germany over this, but I don't think they're going to improve that much. So whoever wins the German election, or whatever coalition is formed, they're dealing with a Russia that's even more repressive, increasing more repressive domestically, and much more assertive internationally. And of course, Russia reveling in the specter of U.S. decline, particularly since the recent events in Afghanistan. Let me just say a few words about the German elections and the different parties. Obviously, you have two pro-Russian parties in Germany, the AfD and Die Linke. They want much better relations with Russia. Die Linke want to leave NATO if possible. And they, of course, oppose sanctions. The CDU, the SPD, the FDP, I would say all subscribe today to what was once the bitterly contested Ostpolitik of Willy Brandt, but they all more or less subscribe to what Merkel's policy has been, this mixture of dialogue, economic relations, and then pushback on some issues. They've all criticized Russia for the annexation of Crimea and the war in the Donbass and the repression of dissent in Russia. And of course, the other events in Germany, the murder in the Tiergarten of a Chechen opposition politician, and the cyber interference that Germany has experienced. So the one party that doesn't subscribe to this Ostpolitik consensus, because it wasn't around when the first Ostpolitik was introduced, of course, are the Greens, yes. And I would agree with the previous speaker that, yes, they have a different view there. Unlike all of the other major German political parties, they have been outspoken in their criticism of Russian abuses of human rights, and much more consistently and publicly so. Annalena Baerbock has said if she were to have the choice, Germany would not be participating in the Nord Stream two pipeline, both for political and, of course, for climate reasons too. Of course, the Greens say that more pressure must be put on Russia to withdraw from Ukraine. But of course, the Greens are also quite skeptical about the future of NATO. So it's possible that after the elections and when a government is formed, you could have a change, a move away from this kind of Ostpolitik consensus of the last, since 1972, the last 50 years. But that would depend, would the Greens maybe get the foreign ministry? If so, they'd be part of a coalition. The Greens themselves, of course, are not united in their view of what should be done with Russia. And so that it's possible that you could see a somewhat of a shift. But even if Germany were to take a harder line on Russia, what would that look like? More sanctions? That doesn't seem very likely. Military aid to Ukraine? That also doesn't seem very likely at the moment. And Germany itself, of course, will still be dealing if it remains the leader, if you like, of the EU's Ostpolitik toward Russia. And so far, France has not been able to push Germany aside there. If it remains the leader of that, it has to deal with a very divided European Union in terms of Russia, as we know. Poland, the Baltic states have a very different view of how to deal with Russia than Germany, France, and some of the, Italy, Spain, some of the other members of the European Union, Hungary, obviously. We know that the Russians are actively interfering in the election campaign in Germany, both in some of the information that's come out about, particularly about Annalena Baerbock, her ties to George Soros, other things about her, but also very actively now with all the anti-vaccine false information that's out there, and supporting, again, what the Russians do in all of these situations, be it Germany, the US, or wherever else, aiding and abetting, benefiting from the polarization that exists in these societies. And so, one area where a future German government will be dealing with Russia probably more intensely is on the climate issues. And these, of course, matter to all of the mainstream parties in Germany. We have a Russia that's belatedly discovered climate change. And so that might be one area where whoever comes to power will be dealing with more actively with Russia. But I think it's going to be a real challenge for the next government to redefine ties with a Russia that, again, is becoming much more repressive domestically. You have many more people now leaving Russia because they just can't live there anymore, since they've been critical of the Putin regime, and a Russia that's still very active internationally, disruptive in Europe. We look at Belarus, we look at Ukraine. So I think this is going to be a formidable challenge for the next German government, as it is for the United States. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Angela. So to help us round out the initial discussions, Stefan Meister at the German Council on Foreign Relations, but Stefan has just come back to Berlin from a unique vantage point in Tbilisi, Georgia, where he's been living the last few years. And it raises, for me at least, Stefan, I know you're expert in Russia. I just wonder though, since you are coming from a place where all those interests collide around the Black Sea, whether you've seen any of this great power competition, how Germany's engaged on that. The Nord Stream 2 debate is also as much about how Germany thinks about Ukraine as it is about energy or Russia. And I wonder, do you sense any, how did Germany think about sort of the big spaces in between these great powers? Or is it really just focused on the great power dynamic itself or just on its own domestic elections? So please, Stefan.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you also for the invitation. I also would like to add a couple of words on Russia, just also to add some basic things, and then I can also say more about Eastern Europe or other post-Soviet countries and Germany's approach there. And I just also made some notes, maybe just to react to some points which were made. So I think just to again also to the broader picture, as we all know, Germany is the leading power in Europe, Russia, and the post-Soviet countries, but it has more and more difficulties to fill this role strategically. So there's a lack of ideas how to deal with a more assertive and repressive Russia, and the current approach or the approach of the last decades does not work with the Putin regime anymore. And I think it's really a problem for Germany with Russia to cooperate with Russia, which does not want to cooperate. And we observe an alienation between Germany and Russia in the last 8 years because there's a complete different understanding of the future of global politics. And this is not only, this is about the whole world. Yeah. So, and Russia supports a multipolar world, undermines rule of law and democracy, weakens institutions, and creates or uses conflicts instead of solving them. So it's more a spoiler than a responsible partner. While Germany benefits from the multilateral order, supports rule of law, strong institutions, tries to solve conflicts in the context of international organizations. So we really have here a competition among different concepts of global politics between both. And I think this has even more fueled also the alienation between both countries. Germany is losing also its role as a bridge to Russia, I would even argue. Russian leadership wants to weaken the EU and transatlantic relations, and it means first of all to weaken Germany. So Germany is not seen from Moscow anymore as a bridge into the EU or as a lawyer of Russia's interest, but it is seen as a problem, as a country you have to weaken. And as a result, Germany is the main target of interference and disinformation in Europe from the Russian side. We had the hacking attacks. And we see also how the Green Party in particular, who's the most outspoken, as Angela also has mentioned it, against Nord Stream 2, is a main target in the election campaign also of Russian disinformation in this context. And from the German side, Russia is increasingly seen as a security challenge. So it's this paradigm of Germany as Russia as an energy supplier, as an economic partner, has been changed to a lens of Russia as a security challenge also for Germany. And also in terms of trade, the trading relations are just decreasing between those countries. So this interdependence is also decreasing. And I would even argue Nord Stream 2 is a key tool of influence of the Kremlin, even without finishing the pipeline, it is already a major success for the Kremlin because it has divided the EU and the transatlantic relations, and it has undermined Germany's prestige in Eastern Europe, in particular in Ukraine, but also in Georgia, as a leading power. You have to look on. Yeah, so Nord Stream 2 is really distracting also Germany's prestige in the forerunner countries in the Eastern Partnership region because of Nord Stream 2. So I think, as I said, concepts like change through intervention and partnership modernization have been failed, and there are no new ideas at the moment. And also, as Angela mentioned it, the main ideas at the moment to cooperate with Russia are climate change, green transformation, city and education exchange, and then it's about Syria, Libya, Afghanistan, where Germany is not really a player. Yeah, German side wants to talk about this with Moscow, but Moscow does not see really that Germany has a leverage on these security topics. And I think a major issue is that the German society and elites are still divided on Russia. And there's still this hope in the wider society that there is a kind of compromise and cooperation with Russia possible. So the learning effect of the last 8 years is there, but it still has its limits. Yeah, and this thinking of the past is somehow still there. And I think a major challenge for the successor of Merkel will be to earn respect towards Vladimir Putin. Yeah, so I think Merkel was really, as a powerful person, very much respected in the Kremlin, even if they disliked each other in the end. Yeah, but I think everybody who follows Merkel really will need to earn respect, and I think none of them really understand Russia or the Putin system really well. Maybe Annalena Baerbock from the Green Party better than the others, but there is not this Eastern German background which Angela Merkel had, to have a and also the language skills to have a better understanding of Putin and his system and Russia. And this will also impact on Germany's policy towards this region. So with regard to Eastern Europe, I think Germany is still one of the most important actors in terms of development aid and economic relations. It has a strong focus on Ukraine, also with Donbass and the Normandy format. Germany is the main donor of most of the countries. Yeah, and it's also played a crucial role in the EU's connectivity and Central Asia strategy. But it's not a security player like the EU. Security is the main issue of all these countries, and there's no will to become more security player in these regions. And even further, Germany is promoting multilateral institutions, multilateralism, but it's not willing to take more ownership also in institutions like OSCE on post-Soviet conflicts. Yeah, so there's no will to peacekeeping, for instance, on the Karabakh conflict after the war. So I think there's a lot of rhetoric about multilateralism, strengthening multilateral institutions, but then when it comes to terms of really engaging also in a robust mandate in peacekeeping, monitoring missions, I think there's no appetite in Berlin to really upgrade also its role. I would even argue if we look to the election. Even if there's a green foreign minister who has more interest in maybe a membership perspective for Eastern European countries and really more tough approach towards Russia, the support in the German society for such approach is limited. There is a overall support in the society for Nord Stream 2. And the more pressure from the US was there, the more the society and German society supported the pipeline. And even for a green foreign minister, it will be very difficult to change fundamentally this cooperative approach. Yeah, also with a still very pacifistic society, and to be maybe more open perspective for Eastern Partnership countries or any kind of military engagement. So I expect a weaker chancellor in any way, as Merkel it was also with regard to Russia, with a limited knowledge on the region. We will have a further securitization because Russia is just pushing more is more aggressive also with this regard. but we will have a society. We have a leader and a government who is in an environment of a society who has no interest to be more tough on Russia and has rather an interest to be more cooperative with Russia. And I think that's in the end the benchmark, with a Russia which has no interest to cooperate with Germany and the EU. Yeah. So, and I think this is a major challenge, and it will be spoiled also by the Kremlin. Yeah, so it will be used also by the Kremlin to weaken and to undermine the future German government. So I just stop here. I think I talked already quite long.
Thank you all. So we do have some questions that have come in. I'm trying to weave some of them into the conversation. So let me put some to you. Please feel free to pick and choose. But there are a number of questions about just the outcome of the election, sort of where Stefan just left off. And the basic question is, it doesn't really matter if it's going to be a coalition anchored by a CDU chancellor with the Greens and the FDP, or an SPD chancellor anchored with the Greens and the FDP. Aren't they all basically arguing they're all sort of Merkel continuity? Just don't want to say it so directly. And you know, they're both. This is a vote for continuity in the face of huge disruptive change. So as Stefan said, doesn't just mean a weaker German government rather than anything different. That's sort of one of the questions. The other is about the nature of great power competition. There's been this debate in Germany and Europe. Janke indicated some of this is changing, that when it was really tough between the US and China, the debate in Europe, Germany was somehow they're the innocent victims being sort of squeezed between these other two giants, and they're helpless. And I wonder if that is really changed, because the other great power is in fact the United States. And there's been some, you know, turmoil in the German-American relationship as well, even with the Biden administration. So I wonder whether there's any change on the German approach to China, this notion of being somehow being squeezed, the bystander, rather than stand up for what you think is important. A number of you mentioned areas of potential cooperation. Janke made this distinction between partner and simply cooperate because it's in your own interests. And I wonder if you would define some of those areas. A number of the questions here have to do with climate change, for instance. Isn't that an area where Germany would want to work with China regardless of whether it's a partner or not, simply a mutual interest? Non-proliferation issues, for instance, maybe another one. What about now the great space of surrounding Afghanistan? How are we supposed to think about China's role there from a German perspective? And then last question, because there's so many, but I'm just trying to give you some choices here. When you think about German relations with China or Russia, how significant are the industrial economic lobbies in Germany pushing policy? If Germany was really leading with its economy, one could argue that its China relations were being defined, to put it bluntly, by the car lobby, and that was pushing a lot of German policy. Maybe that's unfair, but that's sort of the basic premise of the question. And relations with Russia, driven by different sort of lobby, energy lobby, other kinds of interests, not particularly the auto industry, but you know, to what extent do lobbies in Germany have this hold on the party political dynamic? And does it matter if it's the CDU, which tends to be a bit more friendly with industry than maybe an SPD government? So I realize that's a lot. Let's just pick and choose as you would like. And of course, if you want to come back to comments that others have made, feel free. Janke, maybe I can turn back to you now since you've been patient with the others, please.
Excellent. Since I work on China, I will pick two C questions. So I will give you an answer on the car lobby, and I will give you an answer on the climate question. Maybe that will also weave in the cooperation question, so then we have three Cs. That is maybe then helpful. On the climate dimension, I think that is a very, very important point that we find ourselves at the moment. If you ask around Europe, then the answer will always be, well, we need to be partners with China because we need to work together on climate change. This answer is too easy. This is not the right answer to this problem any longer. China has declared decarbonization goals. It is heavily investing in green technologies. It is moving simultaneously on two tracks. It is heavily investing in coal to finance and to reinvigorate its economy after the COVID shock. But simultaneously, it is also investing in greening its economy and is seeking the economic benefit that any first mover advantage here will have, and is seeking to position China as an integral part of the global green supply chain. So we will face China as a competitor, as a rival, and in some areas as a cooperation partner on the climate dimension. Therefore, I think we have to break down the climate conversation into a way more nuanced debate and say we can cooperate with China on sustainable finance. We can cooperate in terms of standard setting globally, particularly in third countries. But most of the chunk of what we need China to do to help the climate is domestic politics in China. And this is not something where we cooperate on, but this is something where China will act and where we need to see how we will face up to the fierce competition that we will face we've seen it in the solar sector, we will see it in the wind sector, we will see it in kind of China's ability to actually scale in these areas. And, you know, in Europe and particularly in Germany, we like to see ourselves as super green and super pro environment, but our emissions are going up at the moment as well. And we really need to be mindful of this competitive dynamic to understand that China has understood that this can be an economic advantage. And if you look at NEVs and other technologies, China's actually leading on these. So I think there's a good wake-up call for Germany, and this framing it as this is the cooperative space is, I think, no longer possible. All policy areas that we face with China will have cooperative elements in it, will have a strong feature of systemic rivalry, and will have intensive competition. And I think we cannot single out a single one anymore where that's not the case. And that brings me to the car lobby, because I think that's really important to understand as well. The big pressure, the big change in German China policy did not come about because of political pressure, but because of industry pressure. And this is like politics turns upside down, that the industry is saying, you need to protect us more because we're losing out on these markets, and not only within China, but also in the competition against Chinese companies on third markets. So I think whereas, yeah, there are still industries that are making a lot of money in China, the chemical industry and the car industry being among those, there is a debate also about how much does this actually benefit Germany? If all the profits are reinvested in China, jobs are created in China, taxes are paid in China, then how much does it matter that it's a German company that is doing this? That being one of the questions that we have to deal with. But this is a real reconditioning of the conversation that we've had. How much do we need to protect our industries in the future? Where and what sectors does working with and in China still make sense? Where does it not make sense anymore? And we will receive nuanced answers for nuanced sectors and areas. And I think this is where we need to bring the debate to, and have to knock down all of those strawmen that we're building, of saying, well, all of those people that caution against like heavy cooperation with China in the economic space want to decouple entirely from China. I don't think anyone is making that argument, but a more critical and a more nuanced approach and a clearer understanding of the dependencies that are created, including in the supply chain. This is what the new government needs to look into. And this is something that this government currently cannot do anymore. But this is something that, because the ground underneath the politicians' feet is changing so heavily, cannot be overlooked.
Thank you. Yeah, Angela? Oh, you're on mute, Angela. You're on mute.
Let me just start off with a question about sort of continuity. If you're talking about policy toward Russia, yes, there's a consensus among the mainstream parties. But if, say, you had an SPD chancellor, I think that does make a difference. The SPD remains probably the most forward-looking party, well, if you accept Die Linke, but of the mainstream parties, in terms of not wanting to rupture the relationship with Russia and insisting always on a dialogue. So I think, to the extent that the chancellor matters in all of that, if the SPD does have a chancellery, that could make a difference. On the other hand, that would also obviously then depend on who has the foreign ministry. But I mean, if you look at even, throughout Merkel's tenure, when you've had, the SPD running the foreign policy, you've seen, times when you have had these attempts to be more forward-looking under Steinmeier, the Partnership for Modernization, things like that. So there could be, I think, a change in accents there. And I do think an SPD chancellor would be more reluctant to do things that would make the relationship with Russia more difficult. Let me just say something about the lobbying. So when the first sanctions were announced, after the shooting down of the MH17 in July of 2014, the Ostausschuss der deutschen Wirtschaft, which is the main, obviously, lobbying group in Germany promoting trade with Russia and all the other countries to the east, and also the Bundesverband der deutschen Industrie, the BDI, which of course is the overall lobbying organization. I mean, both of those to different degrees said in principle they really don't like sanctions, but they understood that for these national security reasons, there were reasons why they had to happen. And if you talk to the people in the Ostausschuss, I mean, the direction of trade now to the east has been changing since these sanctions were imposed. On the other hand, obviously, you do have a powerful energy lobby. I don't know if we can say it's led by the former Chancellor Schröder, but certainly he's a very important person in this. And obviously, the interests that were lobbying for Nord Stream 2 were powerful, and they certainly managed to persuade the Chancellor that they should go ahead with this deal. But I think on the other hand, you have to say that Germany under Merkel has held everybody else's feet to the fire in the European Union in terms of maintaining the post-2014 sanctions on Russia. And it remains to be seen when she's no longer Chancellor, whether Germany's going to be able to do this, since there are a number of EU members, obviously, that would like to get rid of those sanctions.
Oh, thank you, Angela. Stefan?
Mm-hmm. Just to add some points on the first issue with the differences between the party, I would say the stronger the Greens are in this government, so in the most votes they have, the more they would have an impact also on bargaining, on the negotiations, on the coalition agreement. But if we see how they're declining now from 25% to 15%, yeah, so it's really, again, a very sad story for the Greens. They will not have a good bargaining position. Yeah. So and you have these lobbies much stronger in CDU and in SPD, and I agree completely with Angela that the pressure on the Social Democratic Chancellor from his own party basis to cooperate with Russia will be very strong. Yeah, and you have the leftists in the SPD, which are quite strong, and he needs to make a compromise with this group because he's more center-right in the SPD. I think that will have a major impact. But for me, the main issue is how strong is the bargaining position of the Greens, and this will just depend on their voting result. Yeah, and it looks like it will be not so strong. So and that says I think a lot of. Just on very short on also what Angela said, I just checked the numbers where Russia is now in trade for Germany, and it's now in position 14 in the overall statistics. So it's really declining. I think it was at 10, 11 several years ago. Now it's going down to 14th. And it's if you look to the Ostausschuss statistic, it's on the 4th place now, beyond Poland, Czech Republic, and even Hungary. And it's nearly on the same level like Hungary. And Poland has 2.5 more trade with Germany than Russia. So you also know the Polish position on Nord Stream 2 and on some other issues. Yeah, so I think that has an impact, that Russia is really not so important anymore, and it also weakens somehow the position of Ostausschuss on Russia. But sure, the energy lobby is still strong, and then it depends on the Energiewende, how long we still need Russian oil and gas. We still will need it for quite a while. It's at the moment growing, the number of gas, but it will decrease. Yeah. So, and I think this question was more to on China, but I just wanted to say also a couple of words on Russia, on climate change, because this is now the main narrative in Germany. We can work on climate change, green energy, sustainable development with Russia. But if you see who is the strongest lobby in Russia on this issue, it's the oil and gas industry. Yeah. So I think they have the strongest lobby. They have no interest in fundamental changes, even if the melting of the ice in Siberia is going on, and they have fires all the summer there. The gas lobby, oil lobby is so strong, and Russia is, again, not really a partner. with this regard. So there's not really an interest in a fast transition to a post-oil and gas decade, yeah, or the time, yeah. So let's say century, not decade. Yeah. So, and I think this is also there's really a limit in engagement. So yeah, with Russia on climate change. But that can be a topic. And if you talk about non-proliferation, I think this was also mentioned. From a Russian perspective, it's not Germany, yeah. So it's the US you have to talk with, and Germany might provide a platform. But where we are on security, yeah. So where we are from a Russian perspective, we are not on the same eye level. It's about Washington, and therefore I don't see here really a big role for Germany in this field.
Thank you. So we're getting other questions. Let me try to feed. So one question is about, we talk about China and Russia in their own right, but how do you think the relationship between China and Russia might affect German interests? One could argue that it's not quite an alliance they have, but they are certainly cooperating on a whole range of issues. One could posit that one direct impact of that might be to change Russia's own calculus of risk when it comes to approaching the West, NATO, if you will, its Western neighbors, because if it feels China is kind of with it, or if China is ready to stir up trouble in another part of the world as it stirs up trouble in Central Europe, maybe on balance, on margin, that might affect some Russian thinking. I've heard that argument also by a number of German analysts as well. I just wonder what you think of that, or whether there are other elements in the China-Russia connections that would affect German interests. A related issue is to what extent Russia, China are challenging sort of the basic rules of the global commons. So Germany, one could argue, was one of the beneficiaries of open, flows of navigation, of moving things that's so dependent on the global economy as an export economy. Much of the straits in the Indo-Pacific are vital to German, economy, and yet it's being protected by other countries, notably the United States. Does that figure into the German debate at all? That the global commons itself is sort of under some pressure. And then finally, a question has to do with back to the Ostpolitik issue. Could you say that over the years, it's called Ostpolitik, but has it become a Russlandpolitik? That is, given priority to Russia policy over priority to its immediate neighborhood. That Osteuropa-Politik, Eastern European policy, has taken a back seat to what's become now a much more prioritized relationship with Russia, and that Nord Stream would be an example of that. I wonder if you agree with that or not. I think we're in a cycle here. So Janka, since you've again been waiting, maybe I can come back to you first.
Sure, I'll take the China-Russia question because I find it quite fascinating at the moment to look at the bilateral relationship between the two. The first thing that I would note is that we have very limited expertise in Europe on the issue as such. It is obviously difficult to find people that speak both Chinese and Russian. These are very distinct communities. In the Chinese research landscape, it is particularly striking that these are often experts that also don't speak English, that speak fluent Russian. And so these are kind of disconnected research discourses, and that make the kind of research that we want to do and getting an insight into what's going on actually quite difficult and reliant on very few people that can conduct this properly. So I think this is one of the first areas where I would say action is urgently needed in beefing up our capacity to understand the bilateral relationship between the two that is emerging. And the other thing that I would like to say is there are two areas that I'm particularly concerned about in what I see as the emerging relationship, and that is the cyber cooperation, and that is the technology cooperation. And the technology side, what I see it is like the civilian technology cooperation, but it's also the military technology cooperation, which actually then has a direct impact on European security. And this is a cooperation that is taking place It is maturing quite quickly. It is something that we have very limited insights into what's going on. But on the civilian side, we see massive outreach by the Chinese side. We see a lot of human capital wandering from Russia to China, or being in Chinese financed research projects, a lot of know-how that is being transferred. Russia is working on this at the moment because there's still a lot of capital, but China's catching up extremely quickly in this area. And with the with Chinese money and Russian know-how, there's a lot that can be done. Now, obviously, there is some hedging from the Russian side also going on, and that may be exploited, but I'm skeptical as to how far that actually can be pushed back against. I think that's really, really hard. But I do see that this is not actually an area where we can have an immediate impact from the European side on changing the dynamics between the two. But I do think that monitoring what's going on and actually employing NATO potentially on that specific area, just monitoring what's going on and looking at cyber capabilities would actually be a good use for NATO on China, because we're certainly still looking for where can we best make NATO useful on the China question. That would be the one where I see an actual use case also in intelligence cooperation.
Angela?
I would certainly second that proposition from Janka. I think that's a very interesting idea. So, I mean, I see the Russian-Chinese partnership as growing stronger, and you see it both militarily. We just had joint Russia participating actually in a Chinese military exercise. So on many levels, you see that. Obviously, in terms of foreign policy, at least formally and publicly, they always back each other up. I think even though it's clear to me that the Chinese did have reservations clearly about what the Russians did in terms of annexing Crimea and starting the war in the Donbass, you're not going to find any public criticism of that. China itself is now a major economic partner of Ukraine. But I don't think the Russians see that as something that sort of, is against their interests. So I see this as a partnership that's going to get stronger despite all the asymmetries and the reasons that we can logically think for why Russia should be a little bit more wary about this. And I think the Biden administration's attempt to persuade Russia that it should distance itself from China, I don't think they're going to be very successful, because right now, and from the point of view of the people in the Kremlin, Putin and the people around him, they're not thinking about the longer term consequences of this relationship. They're very much focused clearly on what's happening now, and it's backing them up. So I think that could, the suggestion being, could that embolden Russia to do more things that are against Germany's and Europe's interests? I mean, theoretically, I think that's possible. I think leading into this global commons question, I don't follow that debate in Germany, but what you can see is, these recent moves by Russia in the Black Sea to try and deny access to international access to the waters around Crimea, to try and force the outside world to accept the annexation of Crimea. And then you look at what the Chinese have been doing clearly in the South China Sea. So the idea of freedom of navigation, of the way that the maritime rules have been observed by the international community for decades, some of that could be called and is being called into question both by Russia and by China. And I think that is something that everyone should be very concerned about. And I think finally, I mean, to my mind, Ostpolitik was always primarily Russlandpolitik. I mean, the idea being clearly when Brandt started off that by recognizing the different borders in Europe, by signing the treaty with the Soviet Union, that was the key to then resolving the German question. And I think, it's continued to be that this is a policy that focuses mainly on Russia, and that I think that's not only Germany. I think the same is true in many ways of the United States, and that then relations with Russia's neighbors to some extent are a derivative of that. And I think in the German case, you can clearly see that Merkel, first of all, visited Moscow, then she went to Kiev. But the concern that Germany and some of the other European countries have had about not providing a NATO or an EU perspective for countries like Ukraine and other of Russia's neighbors, I think shows then that remains the centrality of Russia in these policies, and however difficult it is, not wanting to take policies that are seen to be presumably necessarily provocative to Russia. And maybe that's just an extension of the reality that Russia is, you know, a major great power, much stronger than all of its neighbors.
Thank you. You can imagine that what a Pole would have thought of thinking that their relationship is derivative of German-Russian relations. But I'll just leave that comment to Stefan. Please, Stefan.
I just add some points. I think all questions are really interesting and important. And I just also need to add something on Russia, China. You have in Germany this debate. I think it's quite popular that we need to cooperate with Russia because of China. So not to lose Russia to China, we need to be more cooperative. Yeah. So and that's an argument to cooperate with Russia, which is somehow strange for me. And I just remember what Karaganov always says. There are only two, and I think he now speaks about three countries in the world who are really sovereign because they don't have allies, and this is China and Russia. And now I think he added also India to it. And I would always say China is with nobody. Yeah, so they are not a partner. They are, and I think that's the same with Russia. They're living in a neorealistic world. Yeah, so somehow, okay, they are different in many ways how they see the global economy, but I think they are really partners. But I also agree that they increasingly cooperate on technology. Russia depends increasingly on internet and digital technology of China, and we have this intelligence cooperation also between both. We have this cooperation in the UN Security Council where they both block certain kind of decisions. So there is a policy which is against Germany's understanding also of how global politics should function, and they support each other on this. So it's against the German interest with this regard. I'm not so sure if this leads to a more risky Russia policy, because I also don't think that Russian elites and especially security services trust China. Yeah, so and they are very carefully also what they are sharing. They also observe how impactful China is increasingly in Central Asia, how it is becoming also a competitor in different post-Soviet countries, but they don't see China, or they see China less as a problem than the US. Yeah, because it's the same authoritarian way of thinking, and I think this is more acceptable somehow to Russia. But I think this is an asymmetric relationship which will only grow. Yeah, and I don't think that means there will be more conflicts because of this. But they will be very careful, and especially Russia will be very careful to give China too much too fast. Yeah, so in a way, on global commons. Yes, I think the point is that, as I mentioned this, Germany wants to live in a multilateral world, and Russia in a multipolar world. Yeah, so and I think they are really contrary understanding of global politics and what are global commons at all. But I think the problem is Germany is too weak to keep this world. Yeah, it would like to live in. And Russia is right that the world is becoming increasingly multipolar. Yeah. So, and I think again, this is a major issue of conflict between both countries. And just one sentence to add to Ostpolitik, I would somehow disagree in a way that it's growing. So Angela made the point: Soviet Union and Russia were the main target of this Ostpolitik. But I would say, especially since 2014, Ukraine is a major issue in German politics. There's a major attention on Ukraine. German society understands much more about Ukraine, and it's more discussed also in Germany. And you have really several narratives also driven by the Greens, but also parts of the CDU and even of SPD, that Eastern Europe is not only about Russia. It's also about the other states. The whole history debate is really there. Yeah. So should we not also think about World War II, about victims from Russia, but also from Ukraine and Belarus and the other countries? So I think it's getting more differentiated, and it's getting less focused on Russia and more focused on the other countries in the region.
Dan, can I just add something to this? Because
Yes, we have
not,
about 30 seconds, 30
Right.
seconds.
Policy toward Poland is not derivative of policy toward Russia. I should have been much more specific. Poland is an ally of Germany in NATO. It's a member of the European Union. So when I'm talking about Ostpolitik now, I'm talking about those countries that are not in NATO or the European Union. So that was my error, but I didn't mean to say that.
No, I didn't mean to imply, but you implied that was sort of a German sort of a perception, and some East Europeans might share that sense. But we're going to leave it there. This is a fascinating discussion. It's just the beginning, because Germany's going to embark on a new chapter on its own politics and political life in just a few weeks. We're all interested to see how that turns out. My impression is Germany never votes for change on election day. Change comes later, and some other ways when German society, a new consensus emerges. And it seems to me at the moment, despite the complexions of the different colored coalitions we're thinking about, it's still on balance a large vote for continuity and some basic approaches. But we shall see. And I want to thank our audience for joining us today. We had an active and busy audience, and our speakers for joining us. Stefan, Angela, Janka, thank you all for being gracious with your time. And to the Wilson team and to my colleague Jason here, thank you so much for helping us. We'll talk to you again. Thanks again. Take care.